Hello. In episode 145, my guest Cory Campbell talks to us about smart contracts. What are they? What's their connection with other leading technologies like blockchain and cybersecurity? And why do they matter to today's businesses as they negotiate what they'll need to do tomorrow? And where does the vital role of the finance professional, the accountant, fit into all of this? And how do you get started anyway? Those answers and more are coming up. Welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of the AICPA and CIMA. From the heart of London, I'm Kyle Hannon. And today we're talking about smart contracts. And my guest is Cory Campbell. He's an assistant professor of accounting at Indiana State University. His teaching and his research interests lie at the intersection between accounting and technology. He facilitates CPE workshops for the Indiana CPA Society, and he does that on various emerging technologies, many different topics. And he's been a subject matter, in fact, for us here at the AICPA, and he's spoken on blockchain technology before. And you'll see links to his previous work here in the show notes to this episode. Just let me remind you, if you've just joined us for the first time, that you can find more than 140 previous episodes of our podcast. Just go to gobeyonddisruption.com and listen through to as many of those as you feel you have time for. And time is what a lot of us have a lot of at the moment. And of course, as things change, so do the technologies. And the right man to talk about those changes is with me right now. Hello, Cory. Thanks so much for joining us. In fact, where are you joining us from today?
I'm from Terre Haute, Indiana, in the United States. It's pretty flat, got lots of cornfields, kind of right on the Illinois-Indiana border towards the southern part of the states. We're kind of smack dab and the heartland of the country, so a lot of farming industry in this area.
And I did mention that you are a university professor. We're recording this toward the end of 2020, aren't we? So still during your academic year, not so?
Yes. I'm at the Scott College of Business at Indiana State University. I joined the faculty there 2 years ago after I completed my PhD from Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio.
You've talked a lot about technology in your work, and we do the same here on the podcast. Mm-hmm. So get us started on smart contracts. Where do they fit in with the other technologies we've heard about, especially blockchain, which I know you know a lot about? Let's in fact start with smart contracts. How did that concept originate?
Well, the idea of a smart contract actually is not new, and it actually predates blockchain technology. Stuart Habner and Scott Serretta came up with this concept of kind of having a cryptographic secure chain of data back in 1990. They came out and actually were granted a patent for this in 1998. There wasn't really a platform for the implementation and integration of smart contracts into the business environment until blockchain came to prominence, and that's Shiitake Nakamoto or someone under that pseudonym wrote a white paper in 2008 that proposed a system for an electronic transfer without relying on trust. That became the impetus of blockchain, sort of what's behind, Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies from an underlying framework. So this idea of smart contracts is essentially software code. It can be executed when the terms of the contract are met. That'll trigger the smart contract to execute. So it's self-executing code, essentially.
So what makes a smart contract different from a traditional, more conventional style contract? And what part of an organization would be most likely to use a smart contract?
Yeah, well, when you think about a traditional contract, there's some elements involved where you've got mutual assent from the parties, you've got a meeting of the mind, and there's some type of bargain for exchange. And all those elements exist in a smart contract, but with a smart contract, we're going to take this and move it to a digital space. A smart contract is such that we can code it almost like an if-then statement, right? If X happens, then Y occurs. So smart contracts are essentially going to be if-then statements. So they're self-governing contracts. They can simplify, and automate some kind of lengthy processes. In terms of a smart contract, I think you could have things like, for example, you can't ship to the state of California, which is going to have a different set of standards than some of the FDA standards, for example, or you can't sell to a minor, or things of that nature would be coded as smart contracts to be incorporated into a blockchain database. Potentially a smart contract could impact just about any facet of a business, whether it's a legal department, the IT department, the supply chain. Potentially it could impact any area of the organization. I think the key is, in order to utilize a smart contract, there's going to have to be a system in place where assets are being exchanged via the blockchain. So anyone could use a smart contract, but it's going to be in the context of blockchain technology.
Well, that's clear. Blockchain is absolutely crucial here. Just remind us what blockchain actually is and how it connects in particular with smart contracts.
Yeah, so blockchain is a self-sustaining peer-to-peer database for managing and recording transactions. There does not need to be any type of central authority or clearinghouse involvement. Blockchain gets its name from how transactions are stored. We have blocks of data which are going to be encrypted and tied to previous blocks, which sort of forms this idea of a chain. That's where the name blockchain comes from. But all the different participants and are using the database are going to be connected to the blockchain. So the power of the blockchain is you avoid a situation where there's a single point of failure. When I think about this, it's a distributed ledger concept. When I think about distributed ledgers, I think Wikipedia or YouTube could be examples of distributed ledgers, right? We could all go down, look at the same Wikipedia link, or we could all go look at the same YouTube video from different points or different nodes on the network. What's different about blockchain is we've got this distributed output, but we're going to put some controls and some immutability around the concept of what is the input. How are we going to validate and add records to the chain itself? So blockchain seeks to add trust to the transaction, which allows us to sort of think about transfer of value in new ways and new opportunities.
I'm just going to jump back a bit. You used a word that's a new one to me, immutability. I think I understand the concept, but just clarify exactly what immutability means in the context of smart contracts.
Immutability is this kind of the idea of one-way encryption. And what happens with the immutability is there would be a public key that everyone could see. In order to validate a transaction, that would have to work in concert with an individual's private key to validate that a transaction actually happens. And with blockchain, it's structured such that, once a transaction goes through this process and is going to be added to the network, the actual network has the ability to either accept or reject the transaction, right? So that sort of gives us this whole idea of provenance, where you've got this distributed ledger where you could see the entire chain of events.
Now, of course, we have to ask about cybersecurity, don't we? Because there are massive hacks happening all the time. So how do we get a handle on that side of things here when we're talking about smart contracts? What are the main tools that we should be familiar with when it comes to the security of a smart contract?
So two-factor authentication, TFA is two-factor authentication. TFA means, hey, I need your login and password credentials, plus I need something else to verify, you are who you say you are. We'll give you a code that self-generates every 30 seconds, and you need to put that 6-digit code in. So Microsoft 365, for example, has Microsoft Authenticator as part of that platform. So you actually could get, in addition to login for your telephone, right, or the face recognition now that providers have, you actually could go out and get two-factor authentication, which will allow you to enter a code to be able to access your information. And it could be a code, it could be a picture, it could be your fingerprint. I mean, there's a move right now towards biometrics, and there's a lot happening in that space. The onus is going on companies to put greater protections on personal data. In Europe and a lot of states in the United States, actually, like California or Illinois or Texas, are implementing laws that protect personal data.
I think we understand security technology. It's there to help verify people and transactions because we can't actually see everyone we're doing business with. It's no longer that kind of world, especially not at the moment. But of course, security technology and verification and all of that sits along that old-fashioned human concept, this thing we call trust, doesn't it? Is that still important, or is that changing too?
So I want to speak about trust. I think the reality is there is no trust between the buyer and seller. So traditionally what happens is that's been the role of a third-party intermediary. And blockchain seeks to build trust in a trustless system by this idea of crypto technology through this kind of one-way hash, right, that we're able to go out and add trust through the concept of immutability. Through the distributed ledger, now that we've got the ability to see the entirety of the transactions, we're able to build trust through the concept of provenance. There's a finality to this. There's a verification or some type of proof of work, proof of concept. There's some type of consensus mechanism that replaces the need for central authority. Because the network is empowered to validate a transaction as it's added to the blockchain. So through immutability, through provenance, through finality, through consensus, blockchain's able to build trust to a trustless system where, the buyer doesn't trust the seller and the seller doesn't trust the buyer. Now, those are the elements that are essential to a blockchain. What a smart contract does, is add some conditions or constraints to our transaction. So blockchain allows us to build trust to the transaction. What smart contracts do allows us to put conditions or constraints on transactions before they're going to be added to the blockchain. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a key distinction that I want to be able to make.
I have another question about trust, because it's smart contracts, based on what you've said, they're changing the way we apply and verify this idea of trust. And I'm talking about the concept. What about some of the other concepts that have become elements of a conventional contract? Things like the intent or the spirit of a contract. You can't really replace those with technology, can you? I mean, what's happening to those concepts?
There's certainly a challenge. When I think about traditional contracts, it's a meeting of the minds, and the spirit and the intent of the contract is an essential part of that. Well, now all of a sudden we're moving to a space where we're talking about digital contracts and smart contracts, and how are we going to take these conditions and enumerate those into code that's able to be automatically triggered whenever these conditions are met. So it's really going to be challenging to make sure that there's going to be buy-in from corporations and kind of a shift in thinking from C-suite, from executives, as we think about the business of the future and the implementation of smart contracts and what all this looks like moving forward.
So from what you're saying, smart contracts represent a very important and obvious next stage of blockchain's development. It's not the only thing that blockchain's helping with, but they certainly, in terms of smart contracts and blockchain, do have an amazing synergy, and that makes good sense to me. And I would imagine that then means they'd have a lot of elements in common. So does that mean there's a standard framework that applies to blockchain and smart contracts? In fact, is there a standard format for a smart contract?
At the moment, there's not really a canned framework for exactly what is in a smart contract. I think moving forward, that's going to be one of the opportunities, is to try to figure out exactly what that looks like. But a smart contract is going to have, a clear-cut definition that's going to be very concise. There'll be a list of variables that are used by the smart contract, a list of functions that the smart contract can execute. So what are the functions? What are the modifiers? What are the events? how are all those things going to be articulated very concisely and clearly? Smart contracts can speed up processes, reduce error, improve efficiencies, but there's some constraints there because smart contracts also can't be edited. They can't be modified themselves. And in some cases, they can't really be tested until they're executed. There's definitely some elements to smart contracts. I think what are the elements of good smart contracts? I think as smart contracts get more embedded into the business environment, and actually, even as the courts start to interpret, some smart contract cases and start to get a precedent, what's happening there, I think that's going to kind of redefine what exactly is a smart contract, what elements need to go in, because it's really, really tough to think about, the spirit and intent and how are those things going to get embedded into the code of the contract.
Good. So lots of flexibility in the structure, the framework there, which I suppose is good, certainly adaptable. So let's look at who would be tasked with the job of adapting them and using them in an organization. Where would a smart contract be most useful to the finance function of a company or an organization?
And so it would depend on the situation. Smart contracts could be used for hedging future derivatives or looking to automate payments under leases. In cases where it's necessary to go outside of the blockchain and get information, to have that information validated and put it back into the blockchain. I think that's where this idea of smart contracts come into play. And they'll rely on oracles or events outside of the blockchain to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, you can't leave everything to the technology to control itself because it won't. You'd still need to have and then apply your own internal controls as well, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Internal controls are at the company level. If there's poor internal controls, that can lead to, unintended additions to the blockchain. If you look at the requirements of blockchain and the merit of the transactions, there may be transactions validated that are with related parties or illegal transactions or transactions that rely on information that exists kind of outside of the chain, some off-chain type of transactions. So it's absolutely critical, more so than ever, that companies really, really have strong internal controls. Those are at the company level, and those exist kind of outside of the blockchain database.
And this is a universal development, isn't it? Because it may be starting in one place, in one region, but it will be influencing the way that all business, or most business, works in the future, wherever they are. How have you seen this rolling out to the broader business world?
Yeah, and to that end, there's a lot happening with blockchain technology globally. Brazil, for example, was looking at blockchain technology and looking at potentially doing a cryptocurrency for their national currency. Zug, Switzerland, is looking at using blockchain technology for either driver's license or voter's rights or some combination thereof, right? So there's a lot of opportunities for blockchain and a lot of things happening on a global scale. The reality is blockchain is still in its infancy. No one knows exactly what the future holds. Blockchain in of itself is this idea of a distributed database. I think, the future of blockchain, particularly when looking at smart contracts, allows us to go outside of the blockchain to grab information and be able to pull that in or put conditions on transactions that are going to be added to the blockchain. The blockchain itself is inert. It can't add transactions by itself, right? The self-regulating but not self-enforcing idea of a smart contract is, I believe, what the future is.
I think we'll have to revisit this conversation a year or two down the line and see how your glimpse into technology's crystal ball has worked out. I'm pretty sure it would. Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of the fact that I talk to people who are experts in so many things that I know very, very little about. But it sometimes means that I have what I think is a good opportunity to come up with some fairly difficult questions. And for me, here's what I think may be a tough question. If a smart contract is so smart, how would it be able to handle changes in an arrangement or in a contractual agreement? Because I know that contracts, ones that you can amend or change with pen and paper, and then you can both just sign that, hey, we changed this clause, I sign it, you initial it, we redate it, it's still valid. We know that contracts sometimes have to be amended or updated to reflect what may be happening in the business on the ground as situations change. But with a smart contract, what happens when we need to update or change the terms of those? Because as I understand it, once something's set in the blockchain, that's it.
I mean, that's going to be a limitation of blockchain and a limitation of smart contracts. I mean, when you think about, in accounting, we use estimates, right? So we'll make estimates for intangibles, uncollectible amounts, things of that nature, right? If a transaction is going to be added to the blockchain, it's through this idea of immutability. It's going to stay on the blockchain. So if there's going to be changes or amended or things that need to be kind of supplanted, as you suggest, those are going to be done with additional transactions. So it's an append-only scenario with blockchain. When you add a transaction to the blockchain, it's append-only. Now, relative to a smart contract needs to be fully executed before it's going to get added to the blockchain. So if you need to amend a smart contract, you're essentially cancel out the existing contract and add a new smart contract with the amendum. Either way, it's not going to be fully integrated or added to the blockchain until the conditions or terms around that smart contract have been met. So, example, if we had an option to buy a security at a certain price, okay, we could rely on an oracle to go outside of the blockchain to validate what that stock price is before it's going to get executed and added to the blockchain. Now, if we want to change the price point where that smart contract terms are going to be met, then we couldn't necessarily alter the smart contract we have. We would need to replace it with a different smart contract. Either way, it's not going to be added to the blockchain until it's fully executed.
Now, Cory, I did this to you earlier when I asked about the meaning of the word immutable. Mm-hmm. There's another word you used which sounded something like maybe a medieval fairy tale rather than something out of discussion about 21st century technologies. I know that when I speak to experts, their understanding of the words they use is totally different to how I, as Joe Bloggs, would understand it. So I'm going to have to probably upgrade my understanding of this word. But you mentioned something which sounded a little bit unusual, and the word is oracle. What is an oracle in the context of blockchain and smart contracts?
So an oracle is going to be information outside of the blockchain. That can go out and be validated. It can either be automated or it could be a human arbitrator, but we're going to go outside of the blockchain to validate information. We'll do that via an oracle. The example a moment ago was, buying securities at a certain price. Well, it would be using an oracle to go out and validate or verify what the market price is of that security, right? So go out to the exchange to verify the price to make sure it satisfies the conditions of the smart contract.
And you also talked about things being on-chain and off-chain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to realize one limitation in the blockchain is, and this is why from an accounting perspective, okay, some of these emerging technologies are most certainly, they're going to have an impact on the accounting profession, but it's going to absolutely not replace audit or the need to go out and validate some of the different audit assertions. We still need to go out and test, the completeness and the accuracy and the existence of these things, right? So the idea on-chain and off-chain is simply, is it on the blockchain or is it not on the blockchain? There's a lot of transactions that may exist, but they're not going to be recorded on the permission blockchain. So that poses some challenges then trying to understand what actually is there, right? Because remember, the things on a blockchain, it's the digital asset is a representation of some underlying physical asset. So that's the idea of on-chain and off-chain.
Okay, that's clear. Now, let's look at a company. Let's picture an organization that doesn't use smart contracts yet, but they may be considering using them in the future. So how would a company know that using smart contracts is the right thing to do? How do they know it's the right move to make? And what would they need to have in place before taking that kind of step?
I think the first step is really going to be to understand, what the context is. Think about digital assets, digital records that use cryptography for verification and security purposes, right? So what is your situation? Do you need a blockchain? Do you need a secure database? If you need a blockchain, what's the nature of it? Is it going to be a public blockchain open to everyone? Is it going to be a permission blockchain where, you have to grant users rights to be able to access? Is it going to be some combination or a consortium blockchain? I mean, I think in the context of where do you want to go with smart contracts? Well, smart contracts are something that can be used on a blockchain technology platform. So the first step is going to be to understand your platform. What is the basis for blockchain? Do you need blockchain? What type of blockchain do you have? So to really understand, what it is that's there. So, and when I think about blockchain, is there some type of exchange of assets? If so, do you want to move to this sort of distributed type of output for that exchange of assets? If that's the case, then smart contracts would be a vehicle to be able to help maximize utility out of what's happening and what the intent of that blockchain is.
Indeed, this kind of technology is smart, but of course, people are smart too. They're also sometimes not so smart. And even a potential game changer technology, for example, like blockchain or smart contracts, they can't fix things that are broken. It's not magic. Everything has to align in the digital world with what's happening in the non-digital world, don't they? They all have to work together.
I think what you hit on is a big one. I mean, blockchain is not a magic bullet, right? It's not the cure-all to what some of the problems that exist. What actual problem is blockchain going to fix? Well, blockchain is a different way to record assets. And again, we've got this issue of it's the digital asset as a representation of some underlying physical asset, right? So I think the catch-22 there is really understanding, hey, this isn't, all we're doing is changing the recordation process.
We can't do this kind of stuff in a vacuum, can we? We all have to adhere to standards and controls. What are some of the compliance requirements here?
So I think the compliance requirements depend on, what's the fundamental purpose of the blockchain, right? So, for example, I did a case study with Dr. Dejo Alexander where we looked at blockchain and smart contract implications for automobile registration, suggesting that the title for cars is something that could be used for blockchain technology. And we were suggesting that, hey, you need to be able to introduce smart contracts. So now all of a sudden, before you're going to get a title from the state, you can introduce smart contracts where you need to do things like validate that you have insurance, validate that you've passed, say, a smog certificate if that's required in your state, things like that nature, to make sure that you have those things that are required before you can have a transaction fully executed that would enable ownership of a car to change from the DMV's title registration perspective.
Good. That takes care of the drivers. So let's look at another role. Mm-hmm. What's important for a finance professional, an accountant, to know about smart contracts?
Well, I mean, in today's environment, everything's digital. It's really, I think, important to understand that, if we view ourselves as accountants as stewards of assets, we need to understand that means everything's, digital. We need to understand things like IT governance and cybersecurity and how these things play together. One thing I tell my students all the time is, it's no longer debits and credits, but rather it's debits, credits, and data. If we're going to be the stewards of information and everything's going to be digitized, we need to think about, technology and the role of technology in different ways.
Yeah, I understand that, though. Obviously, there's so much to try and take in for all of us, especially at the moment. Can you get more specific about exactly what aspects of a business operations that an accountant would need to look at when considering the use of smart contracts?
Well, again, I think it's going to be crucial to understand, hey, what's the context? What is the blockchain? How is it being used? What's the intent of it? What's the typical scenario? Kind of depends on perspective. Are we talking about an accountant perspective? Their set, is it internal? Are we talking about an audit perspective? Are we interested in the accuracy, completeness, and validation of the recordation process? Is it, supply chain? Are we thinking about how is it that we're now able to embed value into our supply chain in different ways because of blockchain technology? Is it electronic health records? It's being used in different places for land titles, voter registration, driver record, birth records in different parts of the world. It really depends on situation and application of the blockchain itself. Once you've got that context, then at that point, okay, to what extent do we need to go outside of the blockchain to get information, and how can smart contracts help facilitate that?
And I suppose, like a P&L statement, there are always debts and credits in any situation in the book, and as long as you're expecting it, it's manageable. But of course, you can't manage everything. You can't expect everything. So I'd like to then ask you about the unintended or unexpected consequences of moving to a technology like smart contracts. Anything to be aware of there?
Yeah. Well, I think first would be the context of the unintended consequences of blockchain. Are transactions being classified correctly on the financial statements? Are these linked to any side agreements that are, exist outside of the blockchain? Are there related parties involved? Do we have fraud or illegal activities happening? So I think there's some unintended consequences for blockchain, and there's also some unintended consequences for, smart contracts. With smart contracts, we alluded to this before, but it's difficult to go out and renegotiate the terms of a deal or to modify the terms of a deal due to some unforeseen error. If you've got incomplete or inflexible smart contracts, then what kind of problems does that pose with settlements and disputes? There's not really been a precedent in the courts for how some of these things are going to be interpreted. So I think that those things in concert could pose some unintended consequences for organizations.
That's good. So lots to keep an eye on, but definitely a lot of potential.
Yeah, blockchain's very much in its infancy, and no one really knows yet what the future holds or what is the potential and what are all the different applications, for smart contracts and for blockchain technology. There are some limitations there, but I think there's also a tremendous amount of opportunities, which is why there's so much excitement about blockchain and the possibilities that it brings.
It'll keep developing, won't it? And as these smart contracts and these blockchain technologies mature, what would you say are some of the biggest potential opportunities that finance professionals and businesses can look forward to quite soon?
Again, I think, looking at some of the opportunities and applications within the supply chain space, Walmart had an initiative where they did sort of a beta test with IBM trying to understand, okay, if we have an outbreak and it's traced back to Walmart, how do we get to the root source? How do we get to the producer, the grower, the supplier of that information? Walmart had suggested that it may take them under a traditional process as long as 7 days to be able to get the answer to that question. Now they're able to get that question answered in about 2.2 seconds. Walmart's moved to a place where if all their suppliers for leafy greens are actually now on, the Walmart blockchain for that reason. You've got this idea of provenance, so you can take the transaction to a Walmart store and trace it back to the distribution center, to, the supplier, the grower, to actually figure out what was the root of that product, to be able to try to understand what's happening just from a health and safety perspective. There's different areas looking at blockchain for trading energy. There's a group of buildings in New York that are actually trading. It's a consortium type of blockchain, and they're trading unused power via blockchain. In fact, in the United States, 28 states have introduced some type of legislation relating specifically to blockchain in 2019. And as a result, there's been 27 bills or resolutions that have been enacted or adopted within the United States. Blockchain is being used in a variety of different ways in different parts of the world as well. And it's, some financial, some non-financial application, just kind of depending on, hey, where is it that we're exchanging things that have value? And is blockchain a good medium for that? So there's a lot happening in the blockchain space at the moment.
A little earlier, we talked about compliance and we talked about unintended consequences. So this is something that we know historically was always the case. When contracts were disputed, when something unexpected happened, the recourse of the two parties or anyone involved as a signatory to the contract, the recourse was always to the courts, wasn't it? And that's still generally what happens today almost everywhere in the world. But when it comes to smart contracts, how is the legal system approaching disputes in this new high-tech world of agreements, expectations, and deliverables?
Yeah, there's been a lot that's happened in the courts in recent years to sort of suggest that electronic contracts are going to be enforced or validated through the court system. When you look at for example, when you look at what I'd call click wrap or browse wrap type of contracts, right? You get on Amazon and you have to click right before you purchase. There was actually a case that ruled in favor of Amazon on some of these browse wrap, click wrap type of contracts that, those engaging in these are engaging in contracts that are going to be valid, right? Even though from a user perspective, end user perspective, it's, click, those things have been enforced. Contracts of adhesion, I think, are another one. So if I've got an issue with most cell phone providers have stipulations in their contract where you can't sue them. If you have issues, right, you can go through the arbitration process, but you actually can't file a lawsuit. You'd have to go through arbitration. So contracts of adhesion, I think, would be another, sort of issue to consider in this context.
Now, I did mention, I think back in 2018, so just around 2 years ago, you presented for the AICPA and you spoke about blockchain. You did it then. You're talking to people about these technologies all the time. In fact, you're doing it now here on the podcast. But that obviously means that here on the podcast, we can't hear people's questions, all right? Because this is recorded towards the end of 2020. So let's see if we can think of some typical questions that you might get from an audience. What are some of the common ones you would get asked when you're talking to clients or you're delivering presentations about smart contracts? What are the typical things they'd ask you?
What happens if something goes bad from a technical perspective or from a personal perspective? How's the legal system going to keep up with all this? The smart contract, what am I signing if I can't see it typed on paper? How do I know what my view of the contract and the paper contract has been interpreted and coded the way I've intended? How can we make sure it actually interprets the intentions of all the different parties? So those are some of the questions surrounding this smart contract space.
Yeah, some good questions. I'm sure there'll be plenty more where those came from as smart contracts become more and more widely adopted worldwide. And as they do, the accounting profession will definitely be here to support and help clients or their business partners implement those smart contracts. So, Cory, what are some resources you'd recommend that would help these finance professionals get ready for these changes, to bed in to the topic of smart contracts and learn more about these technologies?
There's a number of different links I'd be happy to share with you, kind of as far as what's happening at the state regulation and what are some of the current bills and status of those within the U.S. I think that, the accounting profession has been very proactive in trying to understand, what is the implication of blockchain technology moving forward. So a lot of larger accounting firms have a number of different white papers and things talking about blockchain and smart contract and what is the evolution of this moving forward. Cryptocurrency is a type of blockchain. Cryptocurrencies wouldn't really lend themselves to smart contracts per se, but some of the cryptocurrency websites have a lot of really good information about blockchain, the technology, some of the nuance of those as well. So those would be some potential resources.
And we'll put links to some other resources, including some from the AICPA. We'll pop those into the show notes to this episode. Cory, as we wrap up, what's one thing you'd like to leave us with that would help a finance professional understand the opportunities presented by smart contracts and blockchain and help them go beyond disruption?
Smart contracts are smarter, and smart contracts are dumber than what people are. It can't fix everything. It is a game changer, but it's not a silver bullet. It still aligns with what's happening in the real world, so it's something we're going to have to embrace. And how do we bridge that space moving forward? I think it's still very much in its infancy, and we've got a lot to learn. So proceeding with caution would be a prudent thing to do.
And we'll leave it there. My guest, Assistant Professor of Accounting at Indiana State University, Cory Campbell. You can find out more about Cory and his work by following the links in our show notes. And of course, the link to Cory's online profile will be there as well. That's it for this episode of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. You can find out more about us at gobeyonddisruption.com. That is gobeyonddisruption.com. From the financial heart of this city of London, I'm Kyle Hannon. We'll be back in a week's time with more insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you and your business to go beyond disruption. Till next time, keep listening and keep safe. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.